Well, boils and ghouls, it's your old pal, John Kassir, the voice of the Crypt Keeper. And I want to welcome my good fiends of the Horror Heals podcast. Is horror good for mental wellness? But of course it is. I delight in the delicious deaths of pitiful people on the silver screen. So get ready for a hell of a good time with my new fiends, Corey and Kendall, on the Horror Heals podcast.
Right, Horror Heliacs, welcome back to the Horror Heals podcast. If you thought part one with Jarid, aka at 90s Kid Library, was a trip down the spooky nostalgia highway, well, buckle up, because part two takes us straight into the depths of horror fandom. We're talking about The Fly, yes, the Jeff Goldblum masterpiece, and why horror fans flock to conventions like Moths to a Flame, or, like Freddy to your dreams. Plus, Jared's got some killer insights into why we collect stuff, how horror speaks to our souls, and why kids are still rocking Freddy sweaters decades later. So let's get into it. Time to dive into the horror community and everything that makes it, well, horrifyingly awesome.
My favorite movie of all time is The Fly. I love Jeff Goldblum, Gina Davis, directed by David Cronenberg. It's just the trifecta of, I love that movie. I love creature features. So yeah, that one just has the greatest effects. And it's so elegant too. And just the way that it plays out. It's very, what's the word? I guess elegant's probably the best word. But yeah, just there's not too many extraneous characters or plot lines. It's very simple, straightforward, and just I love that.
It is well done, for sure.
It would be fascinating to go to a Monster Mania or HorrorCon with you and just talk about the psychology of horror conventions. And I'm sure as you were there, there's just a vibe that's going through the entire place, Sometimes it could be frustrating waiting in long lines and shuffling through the crowd and all that. I mean, I'm sure it was sold out and you were there, so you saw just how crazy they get. But there's just something about that.
There's a strong, I think there's a strong sense of community special in the horror community. We're all a little weird, but we're all weird in the same way. And I think by finding our people, like other weirdos, we can enjoy each other's company. And yeah, I think for a lot of us, a lot of those people going to those conventions, they might feel very lonely. When they're at home, at work, they don't have too many horror fanatics in their immediate vicinity during the day. It's just not the type of person that they come into contact with too much. But when they're at a convention, absolutely, they're surrounded by a lot of people who have a shared interest. And I think that's amazing. Yeah. No, I was wondering too about, collecting. Do you have any thought? Have you talked about collecting yet in your podcast? Do you feel like there's any psychological benefit when you guys collect things, or?
That's a good question. I think I've always, growing up, wanted to be somehow involved in the entertainment business, show business, creatively. And I think I found my opportunity for that was through journalism and being able to interview people. And I've interviewed a ton of folk, and it's really my favorite thing to do. And it's not just celebrities. I love to just interview anybody, just to find out how they tick. And there's nothing better than somebody saying, "Oh, that's a great question. I've never been asked that before." That's the sweet spot. So I think for me, starting to collect autographs was sort of look how close I am to a celebrity. I think the very first one, and my buddy Jason collects autographs as well. I think our very first one was when Fran Drescher wrote her book. Nothing to do with horror. It's we're going to go and meet Fran Drescher, and then from there, it was I think the next one was Elvira and then Kate Hodder. And then it got into the horror stuff. Yeah. So I think that for me, maybe that's how the collecting sort of started. And now it's just it's evolved into I just love the artwork. I like looking at how people's signatures are, even comparing some to we've got, again, I've bought a couple of, or paid for a couple of Linda Blair autographs, for other people because I've got, I had some from when I interviewed her. And it's just it's interesting to see how she signed her, what her signature looked like when we were just sitting there having a conversation, as opposed to when there's a line of 100 people, and it's how it's sort of morphed into this quick, whatever. Whereas the very first ones we have are very eloquent.
I don't know how I came across it, but I saw some Tippi Hedren autographs. Have you seen the way she does her autographs? She draws birds all over it. Yeah, because she's famous for being in the Birds. Yeah, just a bunch of birds and her name. That's amazing. But I wanted to say, I think that for me, I really enjoy collecting. I think there's several parts of it. I enjoy the hunt. I think the whole process of tracking things down can be a lot of fun. I think that it gives you like some purpose, some motivation to go out and do something. So there's this psychologist, William James. He's considered the father of American psychology. He's also known as a philosopher, did a lot of important work in education as well. And he had this approach to the self where there's different elements to it. So one of the major components of the self is our possessions, the things that we own. So that can include things like our bodies. So regardless of what the government tells you, we own our bodies, right? So our bodies, it can include our family and friends, and it can also include, our possessions, the things that we own, our material possessions. I think when I was a kid, I did have a lot of Goosebumps, and I lost all of them. You know how your childhood toys are, you just end up losing them, all your books, and who knows, to yard sales or whatever, your parents give them away. I started collecting Goosebumps again when I was much older. And when I started getting them back, it felt like I was regaining a part of myself. So according to William James's theory, like when you lose your possessions, even if they are material possessions, you're losing a part of yourself. And I think by collecting these things, I'm regaining some part of my childhood self, like all that joy, that wonder, right? So I think it's a very fulfilling process to actually regain some of these things. And even now, of course, now I have more books than I ever did when I was a kid. But even this process of collecting, I feel like part of the reason we do it is because we're building up ourselves. We're surrounding ourselves with things that we feel reflects us, and we're building ourselves up as a result. So I feel like that's the reason I collect, at least on some emotional level. It makes me feel more fulfilled. But yeah, there's definitely still the joy of just seeing the things, like you guys were saying, right?
Well, and two, you have the opportunity to pass it along to someone else.
Yeah, I have a
That's a
2-year-old and a
beautiful thing.
5-year-old, and they love being in my library. And it just brings me so much joy to see them looking through all the books, checking out the artwork. So yeah, and I'm hoping they're still too young for chapter books, but I'm hoping at least the experience of seeing the books and feeling joy is giving them some like classical conditioning where now later in life, like whenever they see a book, they're just going to feel the joy and want to pick it up and read it.
So love the opportunity to be able to talk to a psychology professor about this for a moment, just because you mentioned how old your kids are and you were just at Monster Mania in August. So I'm sure you saw kids there dressed up in costumes, same age as your kids. How do you feel about that?
I would
Taking
never
your
take them
kids
there
to
because
a
they wouldn't
Monster
behave.
Mania?
They'd be I think more than anything, I'm impressed that these kids that are going to these conventions are behaving. I'm like, wow, they actually wait in line for hours? How's that possible? My kids would never do that. But yeah, maybe when they're older, I'd like to take them. It would be fun if they got to meet some celebrity that maybe they grew up with that is now doing conventions when they're older. But I can imagine how others from outside the horror community might feel that way if they see young children being exposed to horror. I hope and I do believe that parents are pretty careful about what they let their kids watch, and they would be the best judge to determine whether their child's ready to watch a certain level of horror. I'd be shocked if a 5-year-old is going into the new Terrifier movie, just to go watch. Yeah, yeah.
I
Terrifier is
can't
just on
even do
another
that.
level. I don't know if I'm ready for it yet either. I might need a little bit more.
That's just not my thing.
Well, it's funny that our niece is like, she's dipping her toes into the horror water. She just turned 16 and we just spent a weekend with her before her birthday in New York City. And she watched the new Terrifier and was like, yes, it was fine. But then we went to her big thing is she wanted to go to Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. We do that every time we go to a big city. And at the one in New York, they've got the Warner Brothers little Hall of Horror, and she wouldn't go in. And then she's like, they're going to be jumping out. I'm like, it's not a haunted house. They don't have actors here. It's like, yeah, you're going to hear noises and stuff. But she wouldn't go in. She was freaked out. And then, so my sister and I went in, and my sister was even a little bit freaked out. So you walk in, and the first thing you see across the room is Annabelle sitting at a little table with tea party set up. I told my sister, I'm like, well, go sit next to Annabelle and give her a kiss on the cheek. And so she sits down and she's just like, you could tell she's uneasy. And then all of a sudden the coffee cup starts shaking. She's like, I'm done. And then you walk her in that room, and then in the next room, it's Reagan from The Exorcist levitating. So, I mean, my niece would have lost her damn mind, but it's so funny. Like, she could watch Terrifier and be like, and I said, I haven't seen it. I'm like, I heard that the psycho chainsaw scene was pretty intense. She goes, yeah, it was like an extreme version of debit or credit. And I'm like, I don't even know what that means. And then she explained it to me, and I'm like, oh my God. But yeah, she won't go, like she's terrified.
Yeah, I think it really just depends on the kid, right? I mean, like you guys were saying, you grew up with horror to some extent, watched some things that didn't affect you too much. I think that I would say that it's definitely not for all kids. And each child is going to be prepared for their own degree of scares, whatever it is. So, but yeah, I think parents are the best judge. So it doesn't faze me too much to see kids dressed up in their favorite horror costume. Even when we were kids, we were dressed up as Freddy Krueger and Jason, right? They were pretty brutal in their day. So, and even now, I still see kids dressed up like Freddy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Something we haven't talked about on the show yet, and maybe this is something that you sort of experienced when you went to Monster May in August. And I have gone to a couple of horror conventions this year, and of course, this year's just been absolutely insane with our divided nation and politics and all this stuff. And you don't see that at horror conventions. Like, I'm surely, you've probably got that 50% divide there of like, I'm this way or I'm this way, but it's not like in your face like it has been everywhere else, over the last 18 months or 10 years. And so it's nice to, it's nice to escape that. And I think it's like maybe it's a respect thing, just because that's not why we're here. We're here to celebrate our shared love of horror and community. And I don't care who you're ticking on the ballot, next week, but today we're hanging out and doing shots together.
That's a really good point. I think that even some of these celebrities, they had very strong positions on different political things going on around the world. Melissa Barrera, I think is her name, from Scream. She made comments about, the war going on overseas. And I mean, everybody loved meeting her anyway. I'm sure there were some people going up to her who didn't like her politics, but didn't bring it up. Right. I think that there's just something about, we found common ground on something. So let's just enjoy ourselves. Let's escape all the drama, the conflict that we're feeling at home or on social media. And let's just get out here and enjoy each other's company and celebrate horror for what it is, for what it should be.
I mean, it's just another one of those ticks on the positive.
I
agree. For horror, it's definitely one of the main themes of the podcast is for people. Like, if you haven't been to a horror convention, especially if you're a horror fan, it's a whole different experience. It's so different than watching a movie at home or in the theater. It's like just being among your people,
And everybody's so friendly.
There's something to that.
I think for people who don't watch horror, there may be some stigma about horror movie fans, because I guess there's an assumption that like, oh, if you like watching that stuff, maybe you like doing it, or maybe you're secretly a psychopath. But that couldn't be further from the truth, right? I mean, horror fans are just so incredibly friendly. And I think that even like horror movie directors like Wes Craven, John Carpenter, I mean, they all get high marks in terms of how easy they are to work with, how friendly they've been to actors. Whereas if you look at some other genres like comedy, action, I mean, there's a lot of criticisms about those directors canceled. You don't really see that. You don't see that with horror. I think the community is just different. I think maybe part of it is that we are putting all of our fears in the movies. We're putting all of our hangups, our strong feelings of aggression, maybe in our art. So it's not in our daily lives. I think that's the goal. And that's actually Wes Craven talked about in Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Not to keep bringing that one up, but it's one of my favorites in the Nightmare on Elm Street series. And yeah, part of the premise is that, look, we need to put Freddy back in the movies. We need to make another movie. So that way, this fear that we're experiencing in our daily lives is no longer a part of our daily lives, and it's back in our art. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's part of the reason that horror movie fans just seem to be friendlier and perhaps even less violent than some of the other people that are fanatics about other stuff.
Good point. I mean, even for myself, this setting that we're in right now is amazingly therapeutic. And part of that's because Corey lives with this daily, is that I'm an HR person. So, my work life, I have to be the most neutral person about everything. I can't have an opinion about most things at work because I don't want to offend this half of the employees or this half. And so for me, it's definitely a release to come home, get to talk to interesting people about horror. Corey and I laughed because sometimes I'll have a crazy week at work and I'll come home on Friday and say, can we watch somebody get killed tonight? I mean, that sounds dysfunctional on many levels, but it's all in jest. But, there's something, again, therapeutic for me about that scenario.
And he didn't mean one of the people that are tied up in our basement.
I wanted to ask you guys too. I mean, you guys are going to conventions as well. You're speaking to a lot of horror fans. I'm sure you've noticed, there's something about horror that draws in fandom differently than other genres, right? So you don't see comedy conventions, you don't see action conventions, you don't typically see romance conventions, nothing like that. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts about why, like, what it is about horror that, like, there's so many horror movie fans that like to get together and celebrate as opposed to fans of other genres? Like, what's special about horror?
A
Right.
lot of us, I think, sort of feel like outsiders for one reason or another. And it's an opportunity to just fanboy out and know that it's good to do that and have some people who are, just like they're going to latch on to you immediately. And that's really, and I've told this story a few times, so I'll tell like the really short version. But I mean, that's why we started doing this podcast, because when I was at Monster Mania, it was this year in March, when I'm standing in line to meet Sam Raimi, there was this young man next to me who was clearly in duress. He was holding a stack of DVDs. He was kind of muttering to himself, pacing back and forth, and was about to say, hey, if you need to step out of line until it's your turn, go for it. And then somebody complimented one of the DVDs.
Beautiful.
He was holding it all of a sudden, smile on the face, totally comfortable, made a friend. I'm like, okay, well, that's what it is. It's the healing power of horror. And it's therapeutic for us. It's an opportunity for us it's like a family reunion. We've talked about this on the episodes we did with Dave Hagen, who started Monster Mania with his sons. It's a homecoming, So I think that's why they're so big. And, we rewatch the movies over and over again. And we do it with our kids and our nieces and nephews and stuff. And one other thing I was thinking about earlier is that creators don't age out in the horror genre. We want to see you continue. If you want to continue performing in movies, if you want to continue writing, directing, scoring, whatever, we will support you until you drop dead in front of the camera. And you see like these kids, like these 12, 13-year-old kids that are going up to 50, 60-year-old actors who, haven't been in necessarily a prominent movie in 30 years, and they're crying and hugging them. And it's like, there's just some kind of appreciation for like the craft and the creators, where it's like, you're not done when you're 40, and I think we're starting to see that in the horror genre. Like it's been on the fringes all along, but I think we're starting to see it more and more in like mainstream movies, like movies that are coming out to the theaters. It's like, no, we don't care that Danielle Harris is in her 40s. We want to see her on the big screen. We want to see Felissa Rose on the big screen. We want to see Dee Wallace.
Too. Some Netflix shows, right? Heather Langenkamp. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Gay people are pretty diehard for the people they love in music. Like the horror community, we're cheerleaders for our people. And I think they feel that when we're there. I think 99% of the celebrities that attend these cons, it's like a bit of euphoria for them because they get to feel appreciated. Like, this is why I do what I do.
It seems like there's just something really special about the horror community as opposed to maybe even like the comic book conventions. I guess that's another big genre where you do get a lot of people together, but they do feel more toxic. I don't know than what I see going on at a horror convention.
No, you're absolutely right.
Not as friendly.
No. And I started going to comic book conventions before horror conventions, because really horror conventions as like a huge thing is probably only the last 15 or 20 years at most. Comic book conventions have been around, for a long, long time. But yeah, totally different vibe, totally different energy, probably more negativity than positivity, unfortunately, for whatever reason, It's like, I think it's the whole Star Wars versus Star Trek sort of vibe. Like, you don't want to get those people in the same room.
When it comes to
we all
horror,
get along,
right? There's Freddy versus Jason, but we love them both, Yeah, you don't get much conflict about like different camps of horror or anything, and we all. I mean, there's, yeah, there's like the schlocky type of horror fans, right? That love that type of horror. And then there's those who love elevated horror, but there's no conflict between them. And actually, I think a lot of horror fans love both equally. Like me, I, you know, when I do a lot of my grading and preparing for lectures overnight, like really late at night. And it's like clockwork now. Whenever I'm in my library office here, I put on Tubi, that streaming service. They have tons of 80s horror movies I just haven't seen before, never even heard of before. And it's just amazing. Just put them on. Okay, oh, this person's blowing up or they're turning into a creature. And like, okay, cool. Let me get on with my lecture. Let me get on with grading. But it's just comforting to just watch the schlockiest, goofiest horror as well as it is to watch something that's a little more serious and has a different vibe, like Hereditary, which has some serious comments about trauma and motherhood and all that. So they're different, but yeah, there's no conflict in the community as far.
Oh, we love them all from A24 to Trauma. It's everything in between.
Yeah, we do. The only criticism I have is when people act like, the highbrow ones are more valid. It's like, shut up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it's okay to like Jason,
Right.
It's okay to.
Yeah, even some of those classic 80s movies like Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger is just so enduring. And I think even when that one came out, people might have called it elevated horror if we had that term at that time because of we have this dream demon. It's a different type of killer. It operates on specific rules, right? And Heather Langenkamp was so good in that. I love Nightmare on Elm Street. One of the things I love so much about Nancy in those movies is that you have all of these other final girls, final guys. They defeat the villain using muscle brawn, like they fight them or they have guns or weapons, like Sigourney Weaver in Alien or Sidney Prescott in Scream. She's like punching Ghostface by the time you get to the second one, third one. But Nancy's different because she uses her brain. And I also always thought that was really cool about Nancy. In the first movie, she's reading up on dreams, right? She eventually traps them with booby traps, right? She sets up all these booby traps, kind of like Last House on the Left. I think Wes Craven was borrowing some stuff from that for Nightmare on Elm Street. But yeah, but he directed both, so it's okay. So and then by the time we get to the third one, she's getting her PhD, and I think maybe like on some level that like inspired me thinking like, oh wow, yeah, she's defeating the monster using education. So I always thought that was really cool. I admired that character so much for that reason.
Well, you just gave us the perfect segue because if you listen to the podcast, you know that the last question we ask every guest, and I think you might have just showed your hand. Who is your favorite find in a horror movie?
Yeah, for sure. I love them all. I do. Sidney Prescott's so cool. I love Sidney Prescott as well. The way that she evolves over the course of the series as well. She's writing books. She's trying to help other victims, right? I think by the third one, wasn't she doing some type of hotline or something for victims of trauma? My mistake. But yeah, I love them all. But definitely Nancy's my favorite because she had this different approach. She also had probably my favorite villain, Freddy Krueger, villain out of all those classic horror movies. He's just so unique in the way that he approaches the victims. His appearance is very striking. And like we were talking about before, there's still kids now dressing up like Freddy Krueger. And I think it goes to show you that there's something, maybe to bring it back to what I was talking about at the beginning, there's something on an unconscious level about this villain. And we can try and identify characteristics of him, like, I don't know, the fact that he uses humor to some degree, he has knives on his hand, has colorful sweater, whatever. But if we were to try and recreate him and make another successful horror movie villain, we would probably fail, even though we're identifying all the characteristics that we think is what makes him so memorable. But once we try to recreate it, it doesn't work. And that's because there's something about it that we're just not quite realizing on a conscious level. It's somewhere unconscious. And Wes Craven even tried it with some of his other movies, like My Soul to Take or Shocker. He tried to create like new horror movie villains, and it just didn't resonate the same way that Freddy Krueger does. He broke, and I think that's just, if I had like one take home message on horror, yeah, there's something about it that just resonates with us on an unconscious level and really sticks with us. And when something speaks to our unconscious, it helps us feel catharsis. It helps us reach some degree of self-actualization because we're realizing something about ourselves. It's bringing something of ourselves out. So yeah, that's that.
No, it's totally
Yeah.
fine. And I was going to say, Jared, if you haven't seen it yet, Heather's got a documentary called I Am Nancy. And I'm not sure where it's streaming. I interviewed her years ago when it came out, but it really touches on a lot of the same themes that we do on the podcast, which is why, putting it out there in the universe again, we really want to get Heather on the show because I know that will really be a powerful episode because I know, she believes in the therapeutic value of it. And,
yeah, absolutely.
She's been through a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, this has been a lot of fun. You'll have to stay in touch with us.
I'd be happy to talk to you guys again. Just send me a message. For all listeners, I'm 90s Kid Library on Instagram. If you want to follow me there, you can look at I try to post books on a regular basis so you can see a little bit of my library. Maybe you can relive some of your childhood that way, the same way I am.
Definitely share the link in the show notes for the episode, and we'll be doing a bunch of social posts and stuff as we get closer to the fall.
That's amazing. And thank you so much. I love what you guys are doing. I love the premise of the podcast. It really speaks to me. And I wish you guys all the success. It's amazing.
A huge thank you to Jared for hanging out with us a second time and sharing his love of all things horror, plus dropping some serious psychology knowledge. From creature features like The Fly to the unspoken rules of horror conventions, we covered why this genre isn't just entertainment, it's a way of life. Horror fans, let this be a reminder. You're not just part of a community, you're part of a family. One that's always ready to geek out over Final Girls, Freddy Krueger, or your latest vintage VHS find. So whether you're hitting up your next horror con, grading papers with a schlocky 80s movie on in the background, we're looking at you, Jared, or just rediscovering your childhood Goosebumps stash, keep it spooky, keep it weird, and we'll see you next time in your nightmares. Oh, and don't forget, when someone asks, is horror good for mental wellness? You respond, of course it is. The Horror Heals podcast is produced and presented by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.